Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Way Wednesdays. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. My co-host is Gary Schmidt, and it is great to be with you guys. We are enjoying this new thing that we can do every Wednesday, and what we do is we have a virtual midrash. Midrash is a way to look into the text and to dig things out of it. So it's also known as a Bible study, right? But it's just a Hebrew term, and it means to kind of dig deep. It means to study, to be schooled in something. And so we want to dig deep into God's word. And Gary and I were just kind of discussing some of the stuff from God's word. How when you start digging into it, you keep going deeper and deeper, right, Gary? I mean, it's like you never get to the end of God's word. That's what's so amazing about it.
Oh,
Doesn't matter how many
well,
times you've read it, there's more, right?
yeah, one thing leads to another, and then when you start cross-referencing, all of a sudden it's like, oh, and that leads to this, and that leads to that, and it paints this beautiful picture that just seems to grow and grow and becomes high def over time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just before this, I was sharing about what I'm studying for this coming Shabbat, and I'm looking at a verse that I looked at before. It's in Isaiah 28. And then I saw this and I'm like, wait a second, there's like a clue in there, right? And God's like, I'm going to do something like what I did in Gibeon. You're like, well, wait a that, right? What's going on? And so there's a clue in there, right? He's like saying, go check it out, right? Go check it out. If you will, I'll reward you because you'll get to see this really cool correlation. And so I went and checked it out, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's Nephilim here, right? So I'm gonna talk about that on Shabbat. I'm gonna talk about how Jesus is coming back. I'm really, really excited. I mean, that is, if ever there was a blessed hope, right? It's the return of Jesus, and of course the resurrection. But I will get to that next week, the resurrection. But yeah, we're looking forward to his return, and all the stuff that we've been studying, all of this, um, all the studying of the Bible itself, Gary. It's so that we can be with him and we can be in his kingdom, right? This is all preparation for that age to come. And if we can keep that in mind, I think it kind of helps us get through some of the trials of life.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely, and it's really interesting as we look towards towards the coming of the Messiah, and what his coming will bring, and certainly as you've been teaching through the Book of Revelation, we see all this battle going on, physically and spiritually happening, and ultimately God defeats the evil one, vanquishes that, and we see that the Messiah comes, and uh, and part of that too, we see the restoration of the tribes of Israel, the children of Israel coming back, Ephraim and Judah once again uniting. We see how the scriptures, the Bible is spread to everyone on the earth,
Mhm.
so that this is all part of what these end time events turn out to be. So we enter into this world restored by Yeshua, uh, where all these relationships are back to where they were meant to be. And we talked a little bit about this. Gosh, was it last week already? When we were touching on First Peter 2. Um, uh, where we were talking about the kingdom of priests and equating that to Exodus 19, uh, which is the state that God found Israel after he brought them out of the land of Egypt, where he
Mhm.
says, I have chosen you. You are a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a precious treasure. And this is how we find ourselves as the bride. So it really is an amazing thing to be living in these very prophetic days.
Indeed. I'm just going to share something. Some people that have watched my teachings have seen this before, but I just want to share a little quick preview here. Can you see my screen, Gary?
It's black.
Well, black's a
I
good
think,
color.
oh, here we go. The history of redemption. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay. So, we start off with God in perfect harmony with his creation, right? Well, then Adam disobeys, all right? So then creation falls into bondage, right? So these are dominoes. I just kind of read through the text and kind of kept connecting the dominoes, right? So then Adam disobeys, creation falls into bondage. Adam dies physically or genetically. Then we have the heavenly Jerusalem, God's domain, and the earthly physical domain. These separate. So now you cannot go from one place to another. We see that they used to be together. Then Adam loses the spirit that God breathed into him. That would take a little while, but he would lose it even. Well, he lost it right away when he lost the Holy Spirit. And then we see eventually that God will choose and or marry the united kingdom of Israel. And then that turns sour, and God divorces the northern kingdom and he chastises Judah for adultery. All right. Then we have the Redeemer's blood that harmonizes all things, right? So all of these things have been these dominoes that one has knocked over the other. And finally, we're told that the blood of Christ harmonizes all things in heaven, whether they're in heaven or on earth. All right. So once that's done, now we see that we can have this restoration, that the relationship is restored with his bride, his wife, with Israel. All right. And then you have the restoration of the two houses, that the two houses come back together in united Israel restored. Then we have the spirit restored to Adam, right? So these can all happen, in quick succession with one another, and that's what they did. Then we have the restoration of the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. These are going to be come back together. So the two dimensions are going to be put back together. We then have Adam or mankind restored physically, genetically, so death is taken away. Then creation itself is liberated from bondage of corruption. And then Adam is in harmony with God, and then God is in perfect harmony with his creation. All things in heaven and earth. I mean, it's such a cool way to look at it and to see that it's because things got off to a wrong start. But the most important thing was right there in the middle, that Redeemer's blood harmonizes all things, that the blood of Yeshua resolved all of these broken relationships. It did all of those things. I mean, when you think about the cross and all that happened at the cross of Jesus, I mean, it's just mind blowing, right? I mean, there's so much to it, but for me, that really helped to just kind of put it in a little graphic there so that we can get a sense of, okay, these are, and maybe there's more, but those are the things that I saw, and that this is what it did, right? And so this is why we love to study the Word, because we're learning cool stuff about God, we're learning cool stuff about His Word. We're also learning how to interact with God and how to interact with our fellow neighbor. And so that brings us up to the Torah portion for today. All right, we are in Leviticus chapter 25, and I'm going to go ahead and share that for our benefit so that we can take a quick look at that, and we'll get into the study here. Really, when we just let the Word speak for itself, we want to kind of dig in and understand it, of course, as best we can. But the Word is so powerful; it's sharper than any two-edged sword, right? So I'll just do King James for now. So this is the 7th year and the Jubilee year. Now this is interesting because we've been talking about this. We had a guy on that talked about the Jubilee, Joe Dumond. He talked about that, and whether you accept his numbers or not, the Bible does in fact talk about the Jubilee year. So shall we just start reading, Gary?
Let's do it. Before we do, I just want to give a shout out to Michael. Welcome, Tom, down in Costa Rica. It's good to see you. Deb Ellis, I miss your hugs and your smiling face. And Shannon, it's great to see you. I'm glad you've been enjoying Havdalah. Rhonda, Dr. Rhonda, it's always great to get your questions. So welcome. And everybody else who's joining us, I want to encourage you guys. This is your opportunity to ask questions. Let's keep them focused on the Torah portion, so we don't go down off kilter too far one way or the other.
Right.
But let's go ahead and start reading, and then we can. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask them.
Very cool. All right. Well, here we go. So, and the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. This is called Baha, right, on the mountain. Mountain saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, you, your male servants, your female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells among you, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land. All its produce shall be for food." All right, well, let's stop there for now, Gary. I think we can definitely dig out some cool things from the text. Isn't this antiquated? I mean, why should we do this today? I mean, this was old-fashioned religion. This was something that was Old Testament. We don't have to do this anymore. What do you think?
Well, it goes to show that everybody needs a rest. For one, we think we could just go and go and go and work 24/7 and produce as much as possible and garnish as much as we can and eke every ounce out of every little bit of energy or land that we have. And clearly, God is saying, "Look, I've given you man. I've given you 6 days to work and a seventh day to rest." He does the same thing for the land. Um, is it antiquated? Um, well, I don't think God's word gets antiquated. We may have antiquated ideas about it. We may say, "Oh, we've developed technology so we can rotate crops and we can re-nourish the soil, and we can go ahead and continue to strive to make the land produce so much more than it is, and why let it lay fallow for a year? That's insane. That's losing productivity." And it's counter to what God tells us to do. So while in fact we may think it's antiquated and we may have better ideas, we need to step back a moment and trust God. And I think that's kind of the other message that's contained in this is, well, wait a minute. What if I don't plant anything? What am I going to eat? And it really is, kind of going out there on a limb, trusting that, if God says, if you do this, that I will produce a harvest for you, and you'll be able to glean. And by the way, I'll actually give you extra so you can store up. So yeah, maybe the land does need a rest. Maybe it won't produce as much. But you know what? That's okay. That's not a bad thing, because you're going to get extra for one. And again, if we look at the weekly Sabbath, and as the children of Israel were in the desert, what did they get on the 6th day? They've got a double portion of manna. So they didn't have to gather on the Shabbat. Well, it's the same principle. You trust. And of course, there were those who didn't trust, and they saw all this extra manna. Oh, let's gather it up. Let's gather it up. And it rotted, right? So, yeah, some really deep lessons there.
Absolutely. I'm with you. I this is one of those things that, think about it. God said in the book of Daniel or Jeremiah that he would take the people out of the land for 70 years. because they had not let the land lay fallow for those 490 years. So they had a debt they had to pay, right?
Mhm.
And God collected on that. He kept telling them, listen, guys, come back to me, follow my laws. But they never did. They never did. And they got further and further and further away. And it's kind of interesting that of all the things that they did, they were going after Baal and all this other stuff. And the thing that he kind of talks about, like their big penalty was you didn't let the land lay fallow. It's almost like what's the big El Capone, right? I mean, he gets busted not for all the people he whacked, but for tax,
Right, for tax evasion,
right?
right.
You know, I mean, for tax evasion. Um, so it's almost like God's like, all that other stuff. If I were to collect on that, I'd have to kill you, right? Just completely kill you. But I'm going to get you this on this one, this land thing, right? And I don't even think God's like trying to get anybody. It's just that God's like, look, this is how it goes. And I get the sense that God can kind of hold back, though he can hold back the waves for just a little bit, but eventually God himself cannot hold it back because it's justice. It's true. It is what's right? He cannot hold back truth. Truth is truth, and consequences come. Right? God doesn't just snap his magic fingers all the time and just change things ad hoc. It's not how he works. He allows there to be cause and effect, and he says it throughout the Bible. I mean, the Bible is replete with passages that say what you sow is what you're going to reap, right? And so here is a principle that the land needs to relax. You got to just let it chill, right? I remember I this is years ago. We went to Disneyland and they had this thing about um, sourdough bread, and one of the things when you're making sourdough bread is you have to let the dough relax, right? And one of the commentator, one of the actors was like, "Why does the dough have to relax? Is it stressed out?" Like, well, yeah, actually it is, right? And so it's interesting that we kind of understand these things when it comes to being a chef, a culinary artist, or other things. We understand that you know some things need time to just relax. The French seem to understand that their wine needs time to air, right? It needs time to air before you drink it. Like, well, why can't I just pop the thing open and drink it? I mean, that's kind of the American way, but but they understand that no, there's something that this thing that's been created here needs time to do its thing. And the same is true with the land. And you just have to wonder how many pesticides would we not need if we just followed. Remember the Dust Bowl, right? It's because they did not let the land catch up, right? They just kept plowing and taking more and more and more from it until it just became a dust bowl, right? And then it really affected people, and that to me that just seems like a little microcosm of this gigantic thing. I wonder of all the the things that are happening nowadays. I just can't help but wonder and notice that so much food is being thrown away right now. Now, again, I know the conspiracy theorists out there are like, well, wait a second, it's because I understand all that. I'm not neither for or against that in this show. Okay. All I'm saying is the reality is that food is being thrown away. And what if we had followed God's commandments? I just feel like, we've gotten ourselves into this hole. We've painted ourselves into the corner and now we have nowhere to go. All right. And every time we keep making things worse, we have to then implement more and more technology to overcome the disobedience instead of just obeying God in the first place. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I see a question from Sally, which also came into my mind. And So the passage starts out, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you.
Mm,
So does this pertain only to the land of Israel? And
hmm
while the principle of leaving the land fallow may be a general principle that applies to all land, does the commandment only apply to the land of Israel? In other words, other farmers could choose to farm all 7 years and not be breaking the commandment. What are your thoughts on that, Doug?
Well, my sense is that he says this to them in the wilderness, right? So they are landless in the wilderness. They are not agriculturalists in the wilderness. So they could not have started to implement that command until they actually had land to farm, right? So that's my sense of it, that he was saying, look, when you guys become farmers, which is really soon, then start doing this. But obviously, right now, I'm giving you manna and you're not farming anything. This doesn't apply to you today. So I would see that this is a principle that can only be done when you are a farmer, right? So for me, as a non-farmer, uh, I'm not growing things, right? So I don't have to consult this too often because it's not something that I'm doing as part of my livelihood. Now, it does raise other interesting questions. How, as somebody who still eats from the land, how can I implement this? And there's a fellow in our church who actually believes that he should not buy things in the store in that seventh year, and that he stores up and he has a ton of flour ready to go, and he baked his own bread, and so he did that, and I commend him for doing that. I've never done that. I think that's very courageous and it's very interesting, and I believe that it taught him a lot of interesting lessons. I personally haven't come to that conviction that's what I need to do. Maybe he's right. I'm thinking about that, but it is interesting. How do we apply this today? So to answer Sally's question, I would suggest that God is giving a principle um, to the children of Israel about something that is universal, that it's true. That's how I see God's laws. I don't buy this thing that, well, that was only for the children of Israel and that's not for us because that was back then. And I mean, unless there's something that's specific to that land, otherwise I really think it's for all mankind, because I think God's principles don't change. His character doesn't change. His values don't change. His amazing wisdom doesn't change. It's not like, well, I'm just going to tell you guys this, but the rest of you could just go ahead and do whatever you want to do. I see these things as universal.
And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. And I certainly think that the land of Israel is unique in God's perspective, and that there are commandments that apply not only to specifically to the land of Israel, and as a matter of fact, the Shemitah may be one of them. I do agree with you in the sense that these are general principles, uh, but I think that God holds the folks who follow after his word to a different standard than he does to the world, um, in terms of their adherence to the commandments, even though the principles are general in many cases. I think this is even more unique when it comes to the city of Jerusalem, the place where he makes his name, in terms of where you bring the sacrifice, where you come to worship, and things like that. So I may be a little more constrained in my opinion on how that is rolled out. Hey, I got a math question for you.
Uh-oh.
I know how good you are with numbers.
Yeah, that's one of my.
Actually, no, this one I think you are good. So the children of Israel, they did not observe the sabbatical years for 490 years. That's
Mhm,
um, before they were taken into exile, or no,
mhm.
taken into captivity.
Yeah.
So 490 years prior to that, where were they at? Were they still a united kingdom? Did they maybe stop observing sabbatical years after the kingdom divided? I'm not sure on my time frame with that, and I know you're real familiar with that. Otherwise, I wouldn't throw a math question your way.
Well, I'm not sure if I should be, you know, happy or insulted. I can't decide. So
Maybe a
okay,
little
so
of both.
yeah, I'm like, okay. Um, so okay, so they were taken into captivity in 586 uh, BC. And of course, that it was in a few different waves, right? So the first one was in 605
Mhm.
BC, then it was 596, then 586. So, let's just say 586 is kind of the number there. And what's interesting is that there were waves of people then coming out of Babylon. So the first edict for people to be able to leave was in 535 BC. And then when they actually went to rebuild the temple and the city walls, and that was in the next successive waves. So it's really interesting. So you can kind of pick any one of those, and they all work out. So, um, so let's take 586 for example. Um, that would put us back in the time that put us around 1080 roughly. That was the time of Saul, right? So basically, from the time of Saul, King Saul, until the to the Babylonian captivity, they weren't doing this. They were not keeping the land Sabbaths. So, and I was just kind of thinking about your different perspective, and I appreciate different perspectives. Something else to think about, though, is let's think about like the Shemitah, right? The Shemitah is the seventh year when you're supposed to release debts. And certainly, I mean, other countries weren't
The,
doing this.
the Jubilee year, you release
Well,
debts.
but every seventh year, you're supposed to release debts, right?
Hmm.
And then in this, and then at the end of the Jubilee cycle, then you release them again. Okay, so any land that you have had to forfeit during that time will come back to you. But if I make you a loan, and then in 7 years, if you haven't paid the loan back, then I have to forgive you the loan. But it's interesting that we keep seeing, these 7 year economic cycles here in America, right?
Mhm.
I mean, think about it. We had the 2008, well, we had the 2001 crash, right? Then we had the 2008, right? And then we keep having these different things. And I think what's happening is we sometimes seem to squeeze a little bit more out of it, but we keep having these cycles, like it or not. So what I would suggest is that that God is giving his principles, and though he may not be technically judging these countries, I think not following the commandment is a judgment in and of itself, right? So if you got, but if you do follow these things, then you'll enjoy the blessings of these
Right.
things. So in as far as a country obeys what God has said to do, they will enjoy the blessing, whether they know the name of God or not. And Paul even starts talking about that in Romans chapter 2, that even though they don't have the Torah, but they do the things that are in the Torah. It's like a Torah unto itself.
Mhm.
So, I that's where I would suggest that following God's his examples, following his wisdom and his laws is always a good thing. And there may be something special about the land. I will certainly agree with you there, but I do feel that there's a bigger principle, and that we should always uh, follow those principles whenever we can, unless there's an incredible reason, like a really incredible reason that we can't. So
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with you. It's like if you're looking for find direction in your life, it's like, well, I don't, well, I'm not Jewish, or I don't live in the land, or I'm not a priest, or I'm not
mhm,
this or that. Uh, Obviously, so because I'm none of those things, I'm not going to follow anything in the Bible. Well,
mhm,
what kind of logic is that? No, obviously
yeah,
that's flawed. So.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, so I absolutely agree. What about the principle of do not add to or take away from the word? So if you say, do these things when you come in to the land. He
Mm-hmm.
specifies coming into the land
Mm-hmm.
that he's giving them, and those borders are pretty well defined. So if we start to add other land into that concept, and it doesn't just have to be about land. That happens all the time where people add to and take away from the word, right? It's like,
Sure.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
would that? How do you feel about that principle falling into this?
So my perspective would be that God was telling a landless people, right? He was telling people that were not doing agriculture, right? So then he was saying, when you come into agriculture, when you come into planting stuff,
Mm-hmm.
then do this, right? So I think it all depends on how you look at into the land, right? That's the key phrase there.
I got you. Yeah.
Does into the land mean technically over the Jordan and now Eretz Israel? Or is it we're going from having no land, living in the desert, and we're getting food from heaven, and then we're going to cross over and now we're going to start doing agriculture? That's how I would read that. Now again, I could be wrong. I'm not dogmatic about that at all.
Yeah.
But that's how I would interpret that. At least today I would. I suppose
And,
it could be.
and this is exactly why I like having these kind of conversations, because that's a perspective that I wouldn't have had prior to that.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in general principle, as we come with our ideas about Scripture, it's great to come with an open mind
Yeah.
and an ear to hear, um, because
Yeah.
we might actually learn something.
What a thought. Hey, let's dig in more because there's
Sure.
really great stuff in here. All right, verse 8, and you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourselves, 7 times 7 years, and the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. And each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is the jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. In this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. And if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor, and according to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. According to the number of years, you shall increase its price, and according to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the number of the years of the crops. Therefore, do not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. All right, so that's kind of what we were talking about there, Gary. Um, that again, if I find myself on hard time, I can sell you my land, right? So I say, hey, Gary, buy my land. You're like, okay, let me see when the next Jubilee is coming. You're like, oh, you know what? The next Jubilee is 49 years from now. We just got through with one, right? So I'm like, oh, cool. Then I can really get a good price for my land, right? Because you're not buying it, you're leasing it. You're
Mhm.
leasing the land, and we have these today, right? We have 50-year leases, 100-year leases, whatever. I mean, I think America had a 100-year lease on the Panama Canal, right? And then it reverted back to the people of Panama, and I know that was controversial when Jimmy Carter did that, but you know what? It's their land. Let them have it. So, that's the idea, is that eventually in 50 years time, you or your children have to sell me, or that land will just revert back to me. You don't have to do anything. It's just the lease is over and it becomes mine again. But you got to use it. You got to use it and uh, gain income from this land. You got to work the land and do whatever you wanted to do on it, and then it goes back. I once knew some people that had bought a house. Well, they bought it, but it turns out it was leased. The land was leased. They owned the house, but they didn't own the land. Oops. Yeah, yeah. That I don't know who thought that one through, but that doesn't work out too well. If you own the house but you don't own the land, that's a problem. And so they eventually they lost the house, but
Wow.
that's kind of the idea. And again, what it does is it makes us not greedy, because then I know that I will eventually get back my family heritage, and that okay, I have only so much time to use this. You're not going to just buy it and let it sit there. Now, on the other hand, if I sell this to you at we've got, let's say, 3 years left in the Jubilee cycle, I'm not going to get a good price for this. You're like, you know what? All right, I'll take 3 years, but I'm not giving you much money for it. And I'll be like, okay, you know, um, and that's probably okay, right? So it's really to be a stop gap measure, so that we don't find ourselves having to get stimulus checks. We don't find ourselves having to get these various handouts, as you will, because that crashes the economy. God was a really good economist, and he knew that you had to forgive debts eventually. And if you don't, they can keep compounding and compounding until people find themselves in such a state that you can never get out of it. Really, what this is all about, Gary, is about freedom, right? It's about freedom. And if we don't practice the things that God has told us to do, we'll find ourselves enslaved, or we will be the ones enslaving others. And God is not happy about that. He's not happy at all. So we had better take note.
Yeah, I like the concept, the whole concept that's introduced here of prorating the um, the transaction. So it's based upon you pay as much as how many harvests are left in that land, uh,
Hmm.
and even the value of the harvest. Some crops are worth more than others, and things like that. So you're right. God is this great economist that uh, is centered and focused on fairness and equity and
Hmm.
justice. Uh,
Hmm.
and it has set the standard for how business transactions, honest business transactions, are done today.
Hmm.
Uh, it's so much of the way that real estate transactions and things like that, for example, go on today, even down to like determining what your closing costs are. Well, you're only paying a partial month of utilities.
Hmm.
You're only paying a partial month of insurance and things like that. It's all prorated based upon how much you use, and it's comes right from these principles here
Hmm.
from the year of Jubilee.
Yeah.
But I love what you said about freedom, because that's what this is all about. It's about setting the captives free, making sure that you're not going to be enslaved or indentured,
Hmm.
especially to your brethren,
Hmm.
to those within your community, that the tables get wiped clean, and you kind of hit the reset button. And I think
Hmm.
of how important the inheritance was to each of the tribes, and the story of the daughters of Zelophehad and how they fought with Moses, and didn't really fought, but debated, discussed, and prevailed in terms
Hmm.
of making sure that they were going to get their inheritance. And I think that's a principle that we lose sight of today. It's like we think of
Hmm.
inheritance as, when Granny kicks the dust, I'm going to get this money.
Hmm.
It's not the sentimental value of what Grandma stood for.
Hmm.
Uh, that is her inheritance, her heritage, and the things that are really important, more so than the material things.
Hmm.
I think all of those are stressed here in the year of Jubilee.
Yeah. And the other thing is, it's really hard to be greedy when you have to give it back, right? So,
True.
I mean, think about it. Nowadays, in our society, and I think probably in most societies of the world, I can amass and amass and amass. I can just keep buying all this stuff far afield, right? I can buy stuff everywhere if I have enough money, right? And which I don't. So, but if you have enough money, you can keep buying up everything. And what happens is you can become greedy, right? You can start having your empire. You can build your empire, and the law says, nope, you get to keep this thing. This is you bought this, you can pass it on to your kids, right? And so this empire, this land acquisition and acquiring can then be passed on. And so then it makes it that much harder for the next generations that are poor currently to then become landholders. It's not impossible, but it does become more difficult. Whereas God's system says, look, you can lease the land. That's perfectly fine, but you can't have it. You can't have it. And even the land that you say is yours that I gave to you, you're borrowing that from me, right?
Mhm.
I'm the ultimate landlord. And if you're not going to abide by my rules on this land, I'll kick you out of it and you'll be landless again, and you'll live on somebody else's land for a certain amount of time until you come back. And then you'll be like, oh, I better do what God said to do with this. So, really, what God's doing is He's putting in these guardrails to help us from becoming greedy and to help people from becoming uber impoverished, so that because when you don't have land, what can you do, right? What can you do? And this is why so many of us have to do the 9 to 5 grind, because we don't really own the homes that we live in, right? We're paying monthly to the bank, or you're just paying rent, right? So somebody else owns it, and then so you're getting to use it for a certain time. But imagine if you had your own plot of land and you could just hang out there, right? And you had all your fruit trees and all this different stuff, and you were self-sufficient. Now, this is sort of the idealistic, romantic idea, right? None of us, well, probably a few of us really, really want to do that. But the idea is that if you had land and this is your land and you're going to pass this on to your kids, and this is it. So you can build whatever you want on your land. You can do all this great stuff, but you can never lose the land because it's yours. God gave you the land. I mean, it's such a different mentality. It's such a different way of life. And it takes away that fear of being homeless, right? Because you have no place to lay your head. You've got nothing. But God made sure that everybody would have something. And if they get in hard times, they can lease it, get some money, get cash, silver, but then they get it back.
I
It's
think there's
wonderful.
this. I think there's this underlying principle too, that that God intends for us to make sure that not only are we successful, but that we make one another successful. That that my success transfers into your success, and if I make you successful, if I make you prosperous, if I help
Mhm.
you have good crops and things like that, and work as a community collective
Mhm. Mhm.
in terms of making the nation prosperous, making the entire body prosperous. If I
Mhm.
think that's an underlying principle that factors into this entire thing. I was playing this game, Bibleopoly. It's like a Bible version of Monopoly uh, with my wife and my granddaughter. This was a while ago. And the premise of the game was that you don't collect as many houses on as many properties,
Yep.
that you help populate all the properties by helping your competitor, which isn't really a competitor. They're players along with you to get properties as well. And you don't win individually; you all win when when the board is occupied. And if
Wow.
you get out of whack with that, um, you draw a chance card, and it's like Noah's flood, and this happened, and it's like the whole board, everybody's property, everybody's money got wiped out, completely gone.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
that was a crazy game. Uh, but I love the principle was not to accumulate and build up your properties and collect
Mm.
rent and the typical
Yeah.
monopoly thing, but
Yeah.
to populate the board, whether it's your
Wow.
property or not. And I really think
Wow.
that's an underlying theme that factors into the Jubilee. And that's part of the reset because we screw it up over 50 years'
Yep.
time. And
Yeah,
it's
we
like,
do.
okay, time for a reset. Let's
Yep.
start again and let's see if we
Yep.
can get it right this 50 years.
It's a beautiful picture. The Bible Oplay. I want to play that now. That sounds like a lot of fun. It's almost it's it's kind of like clearing your cache, restarting your computer. It's like God's like, you got to have a reset button. This is the reset button, and I've put it in my law because this is what needs to happen. There has to be this reset. There's more great stuff. Let's keep going to the text, because I think what we're talking about is what God's talking about here. It's pretty cool. He says, "So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments and perform them, and you will dwell in the land in safety. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. And if you say, what shall we eat in the seventh year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Then I will command my blessing on you in the sixth year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the eighth year and eat old produce until the ninth year, until its produce comes in. You shall eat of the old harvest." I mean, that's what we were talking about, Gary. And God is like giving a bumper crop. He's like, you're going to have plenty of food if you'll just trust me. If you'll trust me. And of course, the people didn't, right? And I don't think we're any different today, right? We're working on it, right? But this is the lesson: is will you trust the Lord? This is a huge trust issue, right? Because what you're saying is, okay, I'm not going to plant this seventh year because God said that He's going to give me enough. So, I mean, you can either kind of go in there with your plan B in case it doesn't work out, or you could just say, you know what, God said it. I'm just going to relax. I'm not going to stress about this. I mean, look at this. God doesn't want us to be in the rat race. He doesn't want us to have to work insane hours and 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. Nor does He want there to be. I won't say He doesn't want. He does want wealthy people, but He doesn't want the uber, mega rich, where they have all the stuff and everybody else has nothing, right? He's definitely not into that, right? So, and this gets into this whole question of, well, what kind of economy does God want? Is He into capitalism? Well, yeah, He's into people working and owning things, but not to the exclusion of others. So there is a fair amount of socialism built into the Bible. I mean, look at this, right? Your debts are canceled, right? I mean, that's a type of socialism. The land is going to revert back to you and your family. That's a type of socialism. When you look at the whole structure, really, it's the United States of Israel, right? Because each tribe was like a state. It's the same analogy of the 50 states of America, and the United States of America, right? So these were the united tribes of Israel, and so each tribe was independent. They got to kind of set their own, their own idiosyncratic kind of things, but they were all operating on one constitution, right? They were on the same constitution. And our food might be a little different from your food, and our dance is a little different from your dance, but we're all living according to the same constitution. And that's what was really gluing them together, that they would live in this agreed constitution. Is beautiful, just beautiful. And there's all kinds of safety nets built into this. Remember when you're harvesting, you're not supposed to gather on the corners of your fields, because you're supposed to leave those for the poor, right? So there's always this safety net there that God had intended for people. Just beautiful stuff.
It is, and I just can't stress enough the principle of having a community working together. I think we're raised, particularly in the United States, with this idea of this rugged individualism, every man for himself. We're out to win. We're taught to win, and we're taught to keep up with the Joneses, or better yet, beat the Joneses, squash the Joneses, leave the Joneses in your dust. And all these things are antithetical to how God really means for us to live together. But at the same time, there is wide open room for fair trade. For example, I may grow olives. My olives are going to come back in the sabbatical year, and your wheat crop may not.
Mm,
but you may have stored up wheat. I might want to have bread with my olive oil. You may
mm-hmm,
want to have oil to put in your bread. Uh,
mm-hmm.
so there is this social discourse that happens,
Yep.
and this free trade arrangements that work copacetically between tribes, communities, different areas of the land, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It really does work in harmony if we think in harmony, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which is a concept that isn't stressed often enough. Um, as
Mm,
we kind of look at the coronavirus news, we see some of these principles of neighborhoods working together.
mm-hmm.
We're this byline. We're in this together. It's a more of a collective thing than we ever see before. So it is when
Mm-hmm.
when these stressful times hit, I
Yep.
think we do come back and say, I can't do this on my own.
Yeah.
And I
That's
think
right.
that constantly puts us in those situations where, because our human nature is that we kind of look out for number one. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but God constantly puts us in these situations where we have to rely on one another. And with the goal of saying, I want to rely on someone. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, because you can't do it all by yourself, and I mean I sometimes, bump into people that talk about getting off the grid. They're gonna, they have this really romantic idea. They're gonna go live in the woods and, just they're gonna chop firewood and it's gonna be so wonderful. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, that's fine, but do you really think you can do it all by yourself, like completely by yourself? Are we talking like a Robinson Crusoe kind of thing where you're on the deserted island all by yourself and you have to make everything? That's one way you can do it. Or you can, try to reduce some of the stuff you don't need. But still, I mean, I'm going to need shoes eventually. I'm going to need boots eventually. If
yeah,
I have kids, I'm going to need to get them clothes, right? Unless I can, raise my own sheep and then take the wool and do that all myself. It's probably easier if I just find a way to barter and I have something that I can offer.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, God really is into economics big time. But sadly, we overlook this stuff. One, maybe because we have a bias against the Torah, or two, people just don't know, or they think it's antiquated. That was for way back then. But again, rather than us looking at the letter of the law, if we look at the spirit of the law, because the letter may not apply to me, right? So I live in America in the 21st century. We have cell phones and all kinds of stuff, right? So, I don't raise sheep. I'm not going to raising donkeys and all that stuff. It's just not going to happen. So we do have to take the principles that we see and say, okay, how can we apply this to our day where things have changed? We have self-driving cars pretty soon, right? So, things are different. Well, yeah, beautiful stuff here. So um, he then says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. Well, that's a good reminder, right? Who owns the land? God does. Who owns the earth? God does. You are strangers and sojourners with me. That's very interesting right there. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee, and in the year it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. If a man sells a house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it is sold. Within a full year, he may redeem it. But if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house and the walled city shall belong permanently to him who bought it throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. So again, he's got this figured out, right? So if you're living in this walled city, there's an exception there. And I'm sure that we could probably spend a lot of hours just on that one verse, right? To really understand it. It'd be fun to get to get experts, legal experts in real estate attorneys, and say, okay, help us understand and dig deeper into this verse, because I'm sure there's all kinds of things that, as just a layperson, I have really no clue about when it comes to all the ins and outs of real estate law. Gary, I know you've maybe done more than dabbling, but you definitely have some education in that area.
Well, I did recently get my license, but I'm far from an expert. Although my son, he's done this for a while. He's got a pretty good handle on it. And I tell you, there are. I agree with you. We'll get him on the show. We'll get into real estate law. It would really be interesting. Again, God is interested in fairness and in justice and equity, and making sure that people get a fair shake, regardless of what their circumstance is. So this whole idea of what goes on in the Jubilee is just absolutely fascinating to me. I wanted to ask you a question, though, and we may have some other questions out there.
Okay.
Do you see this reference to the Jubilee here in Leviticus 25? Is Isaiah referencing that in Isaiah 61?
Well, let me take a look. Do you recall where in Isaiah 61?
Well, let's start with verse 1.
All right. That's always wise. That's wisdom right for you right there. Okay. Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn.
So is that a reference in your mind to the year of Jubilee?
Well, let me take a look and just get a sense. I mean, it certainly could be. You certainly have a release of debts, right, within the year, the Jubilee year. So, insofar as debts are released, whether or not this is absolutely a reference to Jubilee, I would want to see, something in the text or another verse that would support that. But that it could be, yeah, I'm okay with that.
Because
So
we
yeah.
haven't gotten to the text yet in Leviticus 25, because it does talk about the laws concerning slavery and how that all gets restored in the year of Jubilee and so on and so forth. And does not speak specifically about release of prisoners in the year of Jubilee. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, especially as it relates to Luke chapter 4, where Yeshua is quoting from this passage.
Yeah. Well, I would see a kind of a bigger picture here, even as we were going through Leviticus 25. It was really striking me that Jesus is going to come back, right? He absolutely is coming back, and he is like this here, that the land cannot be sold permanently, for it's mine, right? And that a man who becomes poor can sell his possession, and then it may be redeemed. I mean, Gary, what I was thinking of was Revelation chapter 5. What a gorgeous, gorgeous text, right? So, who's worthy to open the scroll and loose its seals? No one was found worthy. John starts crying, and he says, "Don't cry." Behold, the Lion of Judah, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals. And so we see this lamb that has been slain. And then what do they say? It's so interesting. It says, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and nation, people and nation. All right. So I taught on this a number of months ago, almost about a year ago, but it was fun. But the question is, what is that scroll in the right hand of the Father? I believe that it very well could be the kind of like a title deed to planet Earth. In other words, mankind, starting with Adam, but mankind got himself into a bind and sold his birthright, sold his heritage. He sort of got duped out of it, sort of wanted it, kind of a combo of both. But he was an idiot and, gave up the world, right? And Satan snookered him out of it, right? He got hoodwinked and was left with nothing except death. And so then Satan became the de facto ruler of this world. And that's what Jesus says, that the ruler of this world has nothing on me. Satan says to Jesus, hey, I'll give you all this stuff because it's been delivered. It's been handed over to me, and I will give it to whoever I want. It's all yours if you just bow down, right? Jesus wasn't like, what are you talking about, Satan? This isn't yours. Jesus never contested that because I believe Satan was telling the truth there, that he really did have authority over the planet itself, even though we know from Psalm 8 and from Genesis chapter 1 and 2 that God had given the earth to man, but man squandered it, lost it. And so the only way to restore the planet as a heritage was for Jesus to buy it back. Satan wasn't going to just give it back. He's like, no, 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 no. I got this thing, well, not fair and square, but I still got it. And so he had to pay the price. And again, people say, well, God could just snap his fingers. No, it doesn't work that way. God is just. He's just. He doesn't cut corners. He's all powerful, yes, but he still operates within his own legal system and he cannot break it. Or he becomes a liar, or becomes unjust, or a cheater. He is not a cheat. He will do absolutely. And this is why he died. If he could have just snapped his fingers and made it all better, then why the cross, right? Why go to the cross if he could have just snapped his divine fingers and made it all better? Well, he couldn't. That's the point. He died. So when I think of Jubilee, I think of Revelation chapter 5, that Jesus redeemed the planet and redeemed us. And those things that I showed on that slide, all those things that Jesus restored, his blood accomplished every one of those things. So it's taking care of the fact that I die physically, that I died spiritually, that heaven and earth have been separated. I'm talking about God and man's domain have been separated, that the earth itself is in bondage, that the nation of Israel that God had married was then divorced. His blood took care of all those things. It redeemed all of those relationships. And that's why Jesus is the only one. There's no way, just because I'm a nice person and I do the right thing, it's not sufficient to overcome those problems. Jesus took care of those. He still expects stuff out of me, but he took care of everything that was keeping us apart so that we could actually be together.
So there's this two-part aspect. There's this redemption, but there's also this restoration that occurs. So we're redeemed and we're restored to our rightful situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I love the graphic that you did at the very beginning. It really does. It really highlights what the sacrifice of Yeshua did, at least to what we know today.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
I think there's so much more that we understand that we're learning, and we'll learn when he does return. And it's like, oh my gosh, how'd I miss that one?
I know. It's crazy. But if you study the Bible long enough, you begin to realize you're like, I'm never going to get it all, because there is just more and more and more. And the more I study, the more I realize that there's all these other, right? It just keeps branching out, right? you climb onto one branch, and then there's like 3 or 4 more, and then you go down this one, and then there's 3 or 4 more. It's the ultimate fractal. The Bible is just made of fractals, right?
Yep.
And that's the beauty of fractals, if you guys ever study those. But fractals, you can never get to the end of it. It's like a tree. It starts off, then it branches, and then there's branches on the branches, and there's branches on those branches, and that's essentially what a fractal is, and that's what the Bible does. Is you keep drilling down, and you're like, okay, I've got this thing, right? And then he's like, nope, there's a bunch more, and you're like, so which is nice, because then you never get to the end of it. You never get bored.
You're starting to sound like Doug Krieger now.
Yeah. So what I was thinking we could do is let's get through this text. There are some questions. I want to get to those questions, but we're pretty close to being done with this text, and I think that would be really fun if we could finish that. So I think we can. So let's do it. And we were at verse. All right, so the walled city, and here we go. All right. However, the houses of villages which have no wall around them shall be counted as the fields of the country. They may be redeemed, but they shall be released in the Jubilee. Nevertheless, the cities of the Levites, remember the Levites don't have land, and the houses of this in the cities of their possession, the Levites may redeem at any time. And if a man purchases a house from the Levites, then the house that was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses in the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. But the field of the common land of their cities may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. Right. So, when you think about it, this is, God laying out the rule book before you start playing the game, right? So before you go and start taking your money and buying stuff, you better consult the rule book, because this is what is going to be operative when you go to try to sell that or something. And someone says, hey, I'm going to redeem this now. And you're like, what are you talking about? I bought this. You're like, well, it's in the rules, right? And if we all play by the rules, then it becomes an enjoyable game. But imagine if you had basketball and nobody played according to the rules, right? That's why we have refs, because we want the rules to be followed, and we need somebody to ensure that those rules are followed, because that's what makes basketball an enjoyable game, right? If people could just go out of bounds anytime they felt like it, or they could, carry the ball right from one end to the other like a football, that would change the game completely. If you could get a ladder and just go up and throw the ball in, right, it wouldn't be a game, right? But you have to follow the rules, and that's what makes the game exciting and fun to play. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing with life. There are various rules, and we all want justice to be done when it's our cause, right? But we want tons of grace and just lots of gray area when it comes to my actions toward you. I want you to show me grace, but your actions toward me, I want you to follow the law, right? And so really God is wanting all of us to follow the law, because then we'll all enjoy the game and we'll get along, and it'll be a good time. So
I think the other principle that's brought out here is the fact that the Levites don't have land, that there is this overlay of the priesthood that really does conduct this ministry to God on behalf of the people, and sort of this interface with the people and God Himself, that is part of the whole what do I want to say, organization of the community. That there's this aspect of that again, I don't know that we have an appreciation for. Certainly within the Christian church, probably the closest thing that comes to it is, real well established denominations like Catholicism or something like that, where you've got this class of priesthood and things like that. But it certainly doesn't translate real well, I don't think, into like independent Christian churches and evangelical churches and that kind of thing, where it's more egalitarian.
Yeah. Well, and part of the Levites, they had several duties, right? One was to be the interface with God, but they were also the civil servants, right? So
Mhm.
when they were not doing things specifically in the temple, in fact, David was the one that came up with this rotation of 24. So every I forget the numbers now, but I think it was every you'd go for 2 months and then you would
I think it was
serve and
2
then you'd
months.
go
Yeah,
back home. Yeah,
yeah,
right. And then you'd have 10 months off, basically. So in
yeah.
those 10 months, they were doing civil servant kind of duties, right? They were acting as judges, they were acting as teachers of the Torah. They were sometimes they were, raising a little bit of food here and there, but they were busy doing other things, but they were helping the community. They were the scholars of the community,
Yeah.
um, right? And so they did so much, even though they did 2 months in Jerusalem, but then they did all this other stuff as well.
Well, and thinking of the Torah as the constitution or the law of the land, you'd have to have somebody in local jurisdiction be able to interpret that. It's like, okay, well, what do we do? This neighbor of mine, did this to me, and who would they?
Hmm.
So they certainly served in a lot of different aspects. Not least of which is musicians too, right? So
That's right.
yeah,
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and um, I was thinking about uh, let's see, trying to. I had some notes put somewhere, and I can't find my notes, unfortunately. But the role of the Levite. I mean, because there's a passage in. Let's see, it's in relationship to Hezekiah. I think it's in Second Chronicles, but when the people did not give the 10% or whatever it was to the Levites, then things got really ugly. And see if I could find that really quick. Um, I don't know if I can. Yeah, of course I can't find it right now. But anyway, they had a very central role, and if they were not provided for, then the society started to fall down. In fact, when they were not when they were not provided for, then they could not teach the word, and when they couldn't teach the word, then people didn't know the rules, and when they didn't know the rules, they started going after the Baalim and the Ashtaroth, and they got into big trouble, and it led to massive pain, death, and separation from the land. Right, so it was much cheaper to just pay for the Levites than to not pay. Right, you were not getting a deal by not paying their salaries. You really got a lousy deal by skimping on that, and it affected everything. It affected the crops. It affected literally everything. Their
yeah,
health.
yeah.
So again, just by doing things the way God has told us to do them, it's just so much healthier. It's so much healthier. Just gotta do it. So okay, so let's see here, still in Leviticus 25, and I think we're close to the end here in our passage. Um, okay, we're in verse 35. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gary.
That's right.
Okay, very cool. Share my screen on again, and we will just do English. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, or lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor, sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. So that part of the question of when you get out, then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him. He shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not uh, rule over them one another with rigor. Now, if a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him, and his family may redeem him, or if he is able, he may redeem himself. Thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release should be according to the number of years from the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee. It shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. If there are still many years remaining according to them, he shall repay the price of his redemption from the money with which he was bought. And if there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant. He shall not rule with vigor over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. All right, so there's quite a bit there, but I think there's quite a few topics that we need to just at least kind of gloss over a little bit. I still do want to get to some of the questions. There's so much in there. The thing that pops out to me, Gary, is slavery. I'm not sure what stuck out to you, but so there's slavery within Israel, right? You're within your brethren, but then there's also the people outside, right? And you can buy them, you can sell them. So I think the question is, how do we make sense of this? Because we all believe that slavery is a bad thing, right? I'm very much against slavery. And yet it seems like God is saying it's okay to have slaves. So maybe there are some things that we have not looked into deeply enough concerning that. Now, in this passage, what we did not have is if somebody gets in trouble, if they steal, then they can be sold into slavery as well. So I think part of the question is, how do you become a slave? What did that mean? Did that mean you were less than human? No. So if somebody stole, they could be sold into slavery. I think that's actually a really good idea. I mean, think about it. Well, I know it sounds like, oh, how can you say that? But you know what? Throwing somebody in a box for 10 years in a cage, it's not doing anybody any good. It's punishing them, yes. It's a lousy way to spend 10 years of your life, but it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't do anything. It's not productive. It's a major money sucker, right? It's between $100,000 to $200,000 per year per person for those who are in prison, right? I mean, that's a crazy amount of money. And think about it, in America, we now have prisons for profit, right? So you can own a prison, and the more prisoners you hold, the more money you make. I mean, that's insane when you start thinking about it, right? So there's something fundamentally broken with our system, I would suggest. And so becoming an indentured servant, I think, is a great way to go, because you get to live with a family, you get to learn a skill, you get to learn discipline, and then when you leave, they actually double up on what you're given. So anyway, that wasn't in our text, right? I mean, that's kind of something that wasn't really there, but that's one of the principles that we see in Scripture.
I think the principles are a little bit different in terms of the way we think contemporarily of slavery, and we think of the slavery that occurred here in this country. These were people that were not part of our country, that were taken against their will, through no fault of their own. They committed no crime. They owed us no debt. and so that's kind of our contemporary thought of slavery. As we think a little bit differently about slavery within this Israelite community now, or let's broaden that to say, okay, within the body of believers or within all Bible believers, is there slavery today? Certainly not in the way that we would think of African slavery that occurred, where, as I just described. But these were ways of restoring relationships within a community there were rules around it, there were laws around it, that it was humanely practiced, that that had benefit for the person who was indebted for any number of reasons.
Right.
Whether it was a crime or whether it was
But they
debt
just
or
too
something.
poor. Right.
Or
They got themselves in debt or something, and they didn't have money, and so they could sell themselves. But what about the people that are not part of Israel, right? And
right.
so
So you go to
yeah,
battle, right, and you bring slaves.
mhm,
Yeah, it's apples and oranges in my view.
yeah, yeah.
This text is talking about, I believe, people within the community.
Well, it says that if you have somebody that's not part of your brethren from the nations, they can be your slaves. So I was reading in Joshua chapter 10, and we know the story of the Gibeonites, right? So the Gibeonites heard about Israel, that they were pretty awesome, and so they come up with this plan. They have this really clever plan that so the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, "Do not forsake your servants." Actually, I'm in the wrong chapter. So we first, let's see, we first meet the Gibeonites. Here we go. Okay, sorry. Okay. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done at Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks of their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments of themselves. And all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And when they went to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal and said to him, "Men of Israel, we've come from a far place." And so they say, "We are your servants." And Joshua said, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" "We come from a far place, blah, blah, blah." And so they say, "We are your servants. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us. The bread of ours that we took hot from our provision from our houses. But now it's really old and all this stuff." So then he makes a covenant. He made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. All right. So of course, then they find out that it wasn't that way. So that Josh was not too happy. He didn't listen, but they swore. Okay. So now what? He says, "Let them live, let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation as the rulers had promised them." So they become slaves, but I think it's important to understand that they were never dehumanized. And that's what the African slavery was doing, is it was dehumanizing them. That was a terrible time in human history, terrible time in American history and English history. They eventually, outlawed it sooner than we did. But it was a terrible time because it was dehumanizing. What was happening is just saying, look, these black Africans are not the same as us white people, right? And this was a terrible plague on the white man that in our stupid brains. But it was utter racism. It was an incredible form of pride, and so it was dehumanizing, saying that, well, they're not really humans anyway. Now the Nazis did that just as well. It wasn't about the color of your skin. It was just that, hey, we Aryans are superior and you Jews are rats, right? So it's that kind of thinking that can allow people to dehumanize another because you don't think they're actually human. But that has nothing to do with what happened between Joshua and the Gibeonites. Joshua saw them as being human, but he got tricked, right? He didn't realize what was happening. So they became perpetual servants, be perpetual slaves. They were the wood, they got the wood and they got the water, right? That was kind of their job, but it was never such that they were considered to be less than human and that they didn't deserve a certain amount of respect, and even compassion in certain times. So,
Well, and I think God emphasizes this over and over and over again as he says, and remember, you were once slaves in Egypt.
that's right. Yeah.
You've been in this boat. How would you want to be treated?
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes, I think. We've got a question from Corey, so I wanted to just put this up here. Thank you, Corey, by the way. Appreciate that. A little donation there. It says, when you die, is there a holding place immediately, or there is? So if you are saved, won't go to actual heaven yet? Then when Christ returns at the end of the world, would you be judged again? Well, so there's a lot of things that we don't know about, what's happening. We presume that there's a holding place because in Luke chapter 16, it's known as Abraham's bosom. So when Lazarus died, he went to Abraham's bosom, so he was up close to Abraham, and the rich man went to Hades. All right. So now there's some discussion about that. Exactly what that means. I will be teaching on that a few weeks from now when I get in deep into Revelation chapter 20. But we don't know, right? So I think probably the clearest place, in my opinion, where we would see a type of holding place would actually be in Revelation chapter 6. Revelation 6, we've got underneath the altar, when the fifth seal is opened, it says, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And then a white robe was given to them, etc. So, uh, you know, we're not really told that there is a holding place. I think that is probably I think that's the clearest place that we have of consciousness after death. I'm persuaded that the story that Jesus told about Lazarus and the rich man, I'm persuaded that that is a parable. Now, again, I could be wrong, but I'm persuaded, at least today, I think that's a parable. And so the implications of that would be that we shouldn't probably take that as like this is what to expect, upon death. And so if we are conscious, we might be kind of stuck underneath the altar for a time until we get our new bodies. Or, as we see in a number of other places, you have this impression that you're asleep. So, again, I really don't come down hard on a conclusion on that because I see just some some different positions in scripture that I think you can make a case for either one. But you'll only be judged once. That's the good news. So if you die in faith, then you will stand when you're resurrected. That's when you're going to stand before the tribunal of Christ. You will not be judged. If we are conscious right after we die, you're not going to be judged at that point. At the best, you'll be stuck under that altar saying, "How much longer, Lord?" Right? So you'll be looking forward to your new body. And then Paul tells us that if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, or builds on this foundation of Christ with gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, and stubble, each one's work will be revealed in the day, for it shall be revealed by fire. And if anyone's work endures, he'll receive a reward. But if his work um, is burned up, then he will be saved, yet so as through fire. So that will happen after the second coming of Christ, after the resurrection of the dead. So I hope that answers your question there, Corey, and thank you for the donation. We do appreciate that. And Gary, did you see any other questions that maybe we didn't get to?
No, but I haven't been able to keep up. There's been a lot of chatter back and forth. Let me look through real quick.
All right. So just let people know if there's a question that you want answered, just put the word question in front of it. That way we're sure to get it. Thank you, Jacqueline, for pointing that out. I do appreciate that. Okay, here's one. This is from Rhonda. She says, so what happens to those being kicked out of their homes as the original owners return? Well, again, I think what we saw there, Rhonda, is that if you live in a home in a walled city, there's up to 1 year of redemption, right? But after that, you cannot redeem it. Whoever buys it and then has kept it for a year and a day, they keep it for good, and then they can give it to their kids, right? It will never go back to the original owner if it's not redeemed within that first year. So, basically the person gets a chance to, if you're like, oh, I shouldn't have sold that, what was I thinking? 6 months later, you like, you know what, I'm going to buy this thing back from you, right? And you're within your rights to do that. But a year and a day, it's over. You do not have the opportunity to rebuy that property. So nobody's getting kicked out of their homes without, again, understanding what the rule book is, right? So, you know, in that first year, you could potentially, but the person would have to buy it back from you, right? So, and I don't think people were moving all that often, so it wasn't like they were, changing house all the time.
Right, and I think certainly understanding these laws would flavor the way that you made decisions. It's like, oh, wait a minute, do I really want to go down this path because in 50 years, or that may affect me, that may affect my children. Because so you had to think more long term. It's like, how is this going to be upon my family?
Mm-hmm.
And today we don't, we think much more temporal than that. It's like, oh, this is, well, I'll do something different next year.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think about long-term ramifications. So I don't think this was a huge problem, although, again, I think that's part of the idea of the community to then accept somebody, because this would probably be extreme circumstances. It's like, okay, how are we going to bring people in and
Mm-hmm.
make sure we accommodate and absorb situations like this?
Yeah. Michael asks, so does Satan still hold the title? Not in my opinion, Michael. And I'm getting this from a number of passages, but I think one that we could turn to would be Hebrews chapter 2. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone, for it was fitting for him, for whom all are all things, and by whom are all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings, etc. And okay. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So with that, and also what we read in Revelation chapter 5, that Jesus redeemed us, I believe that Satan no longer holds the title, and so that title has been sitting there. It's been sitting at God's right hand. Well, this right hand, yeah, it's been sitting at God's right hand. I'm my right and left, but he's sitting there at God's right hand, and basically, um, it's been purchased. It was purchased at the cross, but it has not been acted upon. And Gary made a great point that there's redemption and there's restoration. Okay, there's redemption and there's restoration. It's kind of like if you buy a house, but then it's a fixer-upper, right? So Jesus paid for it at the cross, but now he's got to restore it. Now he's got to take it back. Or maybe if you have a deadbeat tenant and you evict them in the court of law, but they don't leave, they just hang out. Then you have to bring the sheriff and forcefully evict them. And I think that's the next step here, is that Satan lost in court. He no longer holds the papers, and he just hasn't been evicted yet, right? He's been given, he's been served his 72 hours. He's got 3 days, 2 days, and on the third day he's out of there, right? If we look at a day as 1,000 years, So he's gotten 2,000 years. I think we're very close to the beginning of that third day, if you will. And that is, in my opinion, is when Jesus is coming back. So, whether it's at 12 midnight or I don't know, but I'll let Jesus figure that out. But still, the analogy is that Satan is now a deadbeat tenant. He doesn't want to leave. And so Jesus will come and forcefully evict him. And that's going to be a cool day. So look forward to
So,
that.
so do you think that'll come in a year of Jubilee?
I think it's likely. I think it's likely. But I don't know. I think it's likely, but there seems to be a fair amount of debate as to when the Jubilee cycles are. There's debate as to when they really start. I know that Jonathan Kahn has a different perspective than Joe Dumont, right? Joe was like, "Oh no, he's off by 10 years," and I'm like,
Almost
"Okay."
sounds like no man knows the day or the hour. Oh,
That's you get that impression, don't you? Yeah. That's, and the thing about it, about numbers is if you're right, then you're right. But man, if you get one number wrong, you are off. All of your calculations are off. And that's why I find the numbers interesting, but I don't want to base my whole life on those because boy, if you're off, then you're just in a big world of mess. So very cool. Okay, so this is a question by Waltiger Poe. Let's see, Shirley, how would that be then? No, okay, these guys are talking. This is from Tom. Now let's take Tom's question. Levites were the tribe without land. True. Yes, we agree with you. Yeah. Now they did have a little bit of land outside their cities, right? So it's not like they had no place to put their foot, but they did not have their own state, right? They kind of had like a Washington D.C. type thing, but they didn't have their own state, right? If that makes sense. They didn't have their own. Yeah, I can't think of a better way to say it. So, all right, very cool. Let's see here. All right, guys, this is great. Just double checking to see if I missed any of your questions. I love taking your questions. So I think I got them all.
there's one at the
Very cool.
bottom
Oh,
says,
there.
so when do you think is the Jubilee?
I don't see that. Say it again.
From Pegaru to E.
Okay. So when is that what it says? When? So when do you? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's the problem. Is that we don't know. Gary, you just spoke with Rabbi. Um,
Rabbi Eisen, yeah.
yes, that's right. And what were his thoughts on that?
Well, so his thoughts, based on the passage out of Leviticus 25, is that the Jubilee has not been observed since the time of the divided kingdom. So since the northern tribes were taken into exile, the Jubilee was not observed. And it bases that out of the passage Leviticus 25:10, where it says, "You shall proclaim, or you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all all its inhabitants." So he takes a very literal interpretation of that,
Mm,
so that in meaning that there must be at least a 50% majority of Jews living in the land of Israel
mm,
for the Jubilees. So this would be considered what traditional Judaism feels is necessary to proclaim the Jubilee again. He
mm,
brings a really interesting point, because one of the things I like about Rabbi Eisen is he's one of the few Jewish people that I've come in contact with that really the thinking in terms of end times. Um,
mm.
and he says, well, and he gets really excited about this because they're at the point now where there is close to a majority of Jews living in the land of Israel now, as
Wow.
opposed to the rest of the world. It used to
Yeah.
be that there were more Jews living in New York and Miami combined, and that's that there is more Jews now in the land. And so I had the opportunity to talk to him the other day and ask him, it's like, well, what constitutes a Jew? Do you count secular Jews? Do you count Bible-believing Christians that are living in the land? What is this population in the land that you consider for proclaiming the Jubilee? And I really was intrigued with his answer because he says, well, basically everybody who's living in the land that believes in the Bible. I said, well, like secular Jews don't believe. No, but we believe that what it says in the Proverbs, I believe I didn't write down the reference where it says, you may be stupid for a moment. And it basically says that you're stupid for a moment. And it's like, oh my gosh, didn't Paul say something about that the blinders would come off the eyes of
Yes.
Jews? And we always describe that to believing Jews that just don't see the Messiah. But perhaps it's secular Jews that don't believe in God at all. And maybe they'll all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, now we get it. And so what was really interesting, though, is that he says, but we've been practicing. We've been staying in shape. We've been getting ready to go. He says, basically, we've been counting sabbatical years since the time of the dispersion so that when there is a majority, when we can start to proclaim the year of Jubilee, that we'll know where to take off from. We just don't make up a year and say, okay, we're going to start counting 50 from now. This is like all things in the Bible, right? We pay attention to the details, and we don't just lose track, or we just don't go on hiatus for a while and then pick it back up and start from ground zero. No, and I think this is a lesson that we should all take. Is like we should all be in practice. And for those of you who have come into understanding the Torah as a Christian believer, it's like, oh, the feasts and the festivals, these are dress rehearsals. These are things that really are meaningful, and maybe we should be doing these because we saw the fulfillment of Yeshua in the Passover. We saw it's the fulfillment in the Feast of Shavuot, and these really are rehearsals, and we should be exercising this and getting familiar with them so that when the day comes for his return, we're not just like, well, what do we do now? So he's of the same mindset that, no, we should be in practice so that when it comes time, that they know when to start counting the 50th year, and they'll start counting year one. So in his mind, it's 50 years from the time that they feel they can start to proclaim the Jubilee, which again, in his mind is there is a majority of Jews, or near a majority of Jews, for the first time since the exile. I mean, think of that. That's what, that's 3,000 years?
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow. Isn't that exciting? I mean, that's just really cool stuff. We got a few more questions. I'm going to see if we can just kind of zip through these because we're kind of way over time. This is Michael. He asks, is slave and servant the same in Hebrew? Yes. All right. So slave and servant are the same. Eved is the word there. So hope that answers the question. Oh, Stephen has a big fat question. Is the 50th year a break in the Sabbath cycle of years 6 + 1 × 7 = 49? Then Jubilee year, that seems to be what the scriptures say, and the count starts from when Joshua went into the land. I think so, Stephen. We did have Joe Dumont on here, and I think that was his belief that you have 49 + 1, and that 1 is actually the beginning of the next cycle. I'm not a specialist on that, so I have not devoted the time to studying the Jubilee cycles.
I did ask for
Gary, you spoke with Eisen about that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so the traditional rabbinic thought is that it's 49 years plus 1 year for the sabbatical year, and then after the Jubilee year, and then after the Jubilee year, you count from 1 again. Okay. So the 50th year is it's a year unto itself.
Mhm. And then
And
the 51st year would be actually the beginning of the
it's
next
the
cycle.
first year of the sabbatical
Yeah,
cycle.
yeah. There's differences of opinion on this, okay? And this is again why if you put all of your eggs in this mathematical basket when it comes to like end times and stuff, if just one of your numbers is wrong, then your whole system comes crashing down. So I find numbers interesting, but I don't want to base my life on those. Stephen also asks, why would there be a break in the cycles? Well, because people were out and about. They were in captivity, and people were not in the land, and they were not self-governing. So these kind of things may have been forgotten. They may have been lost. Maybe they haven't been, but there's certainly it's not clear. It's not like everybody knew when the Jubilee year was going to be because they were all celebrating it. So this is something that has to be studied out to kind of figure out where we are. And I think this is where it's wise to listen to different perspectives on this. So yeah, fantastic, guys. This is great, wonderful. Thank you for your questions. We miss you. We want to make an announcement for people that are local. We are planning on doing something for Shavuot, for the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. That's going to be May 31st, right, Gary?
Correct.
Yeah. So details will be coming, but we'll be getting together probably at a park. That's the plan right now. And we're going to eat and fellowship and, not too closely, but we're going to still say hi. So that's the plan right now. And pray for good weather, okay? I think last year it was like super cold, and then the next day it was super hot. So that's Colorado for you. Thank you, guys. God bless you. Have a great day, and we will see you. Come join us Friday for our Erev Shabbat candle lighting and fellowship, and then Saturday morning, Shabbat morning, we will be starting at 10:30 with worship, and then the study of the Word. So God bless you.